Previously in this module, we learned that reading comprehension passages are written in a kind of textbook style. These make up the majority of the reading comprehension passages on the GRE. There is one other kind of reading comprehension question, where the passages are written as arguments. They're not particularly common. In fact, you will likely only see between 2 and 4 questions related to the argument passage type on your GRE. So if you're short on time to study, the next couple of lessons and practice questions should be your lowest priority. Nevertheless, you cannot expect to earn a top GRE score without at least considering argument passages. Argument passages can be identified by the question type. For example, one question type requires us to weaken an argument. Another question type requires us to identify an unstated assumption in the argument. And another question type requires us to identify a conclusion that must follow from the given information. Identifying the question type not only helps us recognize that we're looking at an argument passage, but also helps us determine how to dissect the argument and the answer choices. The purpose of argument questions is to test your ability to reason effectively. To do so, the GRE presents you with some kind of argument, just like this one. Now the main body of the text here is called the passage. The next part that contains the question is called the question stem. And these are the answer choices from which you must choose the best answer. Argument passages always have 5 multiple choice options. It's important to note here that unlike math questions, for which we're required to find the one correct answer, verbal questions require us to find the best answer. So although one answer choice may seem pretty good, it's possible that another answer choice is even better. If we stop checking answer choices once we spot one that looks good, we may miss the better answer choice later on. So be sure to check all answer choices before making your selection. Also, remember to keep your thought process on your scratch paper. Always write down the number of the question and the letters A through E. As you work through the answers, cross off the letters of the answer you know are wrong, put a wavy line next to the answers of the questions you're unsure of, and put a check mark next to the letters of the answer you really like. If you get stuck among a few choices, you can skip ahead and come back to a question with a fresh perspective, but you don't have to start your analysis from scratch. Now, how exactly does an argument question test your ability to reason? Well, the questions that accompany an argument passage require you to understand how the different parts of the passage work together. Most argument passages on the GRE will consist of premises and a conclusion. The conclusion is what the author is trying to convince you of, and the premises are the evidence that the author uses to support the conclusion. Let's look at an example. If you've ever taken a course in formal logic, this will likely be the first argument that you examined. The argument goes like this: all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. In this argument, the conclusion is Socrates is mortal. This is what the author is trying to convince you of. The remaining 2 sentences are premises that support the conclusion. In other words, they provide the evidence needed to draw the conclusion. Okay, now consider this argument. In this argument, the conclusion is that Gary will be late for work today. The premises that support this conclusion are the fact that Gary has arrived late for the past 3 days, and Gary's car got a flat tire on the way to work. Now, of these 2 arguments, which one is more convincing? In other words, which argument is stronger? As you'll see, a lot of argument questions on the GRE concern the strength of a given argument. But what does it mean to say that an argument is strong? Well, we say that the strength of an argument depends on how well the conclusion follows from the given premises. Let's consider the second argument. If it's true that Gary has been late for the past 3 days, and Gary got a flat tire on the way to work today, then how well does it follow that Gary must be late for work today? Well, it seems likely that Gary will be late, but I'm not as certain about this conclusion as I am about the conclusion regarding Socrates. While the argument about Gary might be somewhat strong, it's not as strong as the Socrates argument. The arguments you will encounter on the GRE are similar to the arguments about Gary. They will be less than perfect, and our task will often be to weaken or strengthen them by adding new premises or modifying the existing premises. For example, notice what happens when we take the argument about Gary and we change it so that he's been late to work for the past 53 days. This new premise would seem to strengthen the conclusion that Gary will be late to work today. Now, does this mean that the conclusion is guaranteed? Absolutely not. It's still possible that Gary will arrive on time today. What if we modify the argument further and say that instead of one flat tire, Gary had 4 flat tires and his engine exploded? Does this guarantee the conclusion? Well, this new information certainly seems to strengthen the conclusion that Gary will be late, but it's still possible that he could arrive to work on time. For example, he might just leave his car and walk to work. Remember, we need to select the best answer to these questions, so we would have to consider which of these possibilities most strengthens the argument. Alternatively, notice what happens when we take the original argument and add the premise, Gary's house is 1 block from work. By adding this premise, we're weakening the argument. While it's still possible that Gary will arrive late for work, the fact that he lives so close does weaken the extent to which the conclusion follows from the premises. So, the 2 important takeaways here are that on the GRE, the conclusions in most arguments are not guaranteed. And most arguments can be strengthened or weakened by adding to or altering the premises. Now, whenever we determine the strength of an argument on the GRE, it's very important to note that we must always accept all premises as being true. So when determining the strength of the original argument involving Gary, we cannot question the truth of the premises. For example, we can't say that this is a weak argument because Gary did not get a flat tire, or that Gary was not late to work for the past 3 days. These premises must be accepted as true. When gauging the strength of an argument, we must examine only the degree to which the conclusion follows from the premises. Consider this argument, for example. All pigs can fly. Mount Everest is a pig, therefore Mount Everest can fly. Is this a strong argument? It might sound silly, but since we must accept the premises as true, and all pigs can indeed fly, and Mount Everest is a pig, well then it must be the case that Mount Everest can fly. Since the conclusion definitely follows from the premises, this argument is perfect. Conversely, changing the conclusion to read, therefore Mount Everest cannot fly, would make this an invalid argument. Even though we all know that mountains cannot fly, this is a bad argument only because the conclusion does not follow from the premises. In addition to having premises and conclusions, there's a third feature that most arguments share. Most arguments have assumptions that are needed to make the conclusions follow. An assumption is essentially an unstated premise that is necessary to help us reach the given conclusion. For example, in the argument about Gary, what sort of unstated assumptions are required for us to reach the conclusion that Gary will be late today? Well, we need to assume that Gary's previous record of lateness will be repeated today. We also need to assume that if Gary must fix his flat tire, the time it will take him to do so will exceed the amount of time before work starts. And we also need to assume that Gary has no other means by which to get to work on time. There are other unstated assumptions here, but you get the idea. Okay, so now that we've identified the 3 main components of an argument, the general structure of most arguments goes something like this. We take some premises, we add some assumptions, and this allows us to arrive at a conclusion. Notice that I made the assumptions gray here to indicate that assumptions are unstated within the argument. Okay, this is the basic structure of an argument. Let's summarize. In this lesson, We learned about the format of the argument passages and questions. We also examined pieces that make up an argument. We learned how to determine the strength of an argument, and we learned that we must accept all premises as true. In the next lesson, we'll practice breaking down the passage into its premises and conclusion, and then we'll practice identifying assumptions.